Thank you for joining us today, Professor Reitzner. Please tell us a little about your academic background and why you came to give evidence at the Osnabrück Criminal Court yesterday.
I'm a mathematician. I hold a chair in probability theory and statistics at the University of Osnabrück. And at the same time, I'm an actuary, and I have studied insurance mathematics, and I'm teaching insurance mathematics and many students here in Osnabrück. In particular, I'm teaching how to calculate the expected number of deaths and the expected number of people being alive in different stages for a certain population. That's one of the important tasks in insurance mathematics. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I was wondering how many people died due to the pandemic, what is the excess mortality, and this is the reason why I got interested. And clearly this is an important topic, or has already been an important topic at all conferences in insurance mathematics.
Going back to 2020 in Germany, what were your thoughts about what was happening at that time?
Mm-hmm. At the very beginning, it was unclear to maybe all of us what is really going on here. So politicians said that a large number of people is dying due to corona, and the number of people was something like 80,000 in the first year. And then I was interested to check, using the data from the Statistical Federal Office in Germany, whether these people who died due to corona, according to the Robert Koch Institute, if they are excess deaths, or how many of these people, from a statistical point of view, have been expected to die. And this was my starting point, wanting to check what is really the excess mortality in the first year, and if it is as catastrophic as it was pointed out by politicians.
You are one among a tiny number of academics in Germany who have essentially refuted the premise that there was a deadly pandemic. Why do you think it is that you find yourself in such a small group?
Okay, maybe insurance mathematics is not one of the most popular subjects in mathematics, so there are not so many people who are doing regularly checking what is going on in the expected number of people who should die or something like this. This is the first reason. The second reason is that it was very hard to recognize that you should not believe what politicians said and what the Robert Koch Institute said. So if you are a scientist and then you hear from all sides, it's a catastrophe, a huge amount of people die, then to really check and to see that this is not true, this is something which is difficult. And then you have to face that a large number of colleagues have a very different opinion on this subject than you have, and you have to stand that. That's not easy.
Considering that some German professors, like Sucharit Bhakdi and Stefan Hockertz, were calling the alarm in 2020 about possible disastrous consequences of using these injections on humans, for which they were heavily censored, what do you think has gone wrong in science and government, which has allowed these toxic products to be put on the market?
It's hard to answer this question. What I see is that people want to believe what the government says. This is something which seems to be a very German thing. Say, I'm from Austria, and there it's slightly different. In Austria, we would say, yes, we believe what the government says, but if then you talk to your neighbors, then it's quite clear what the government says should not be believed. That cannot be true because the government says that, so it must be false. And in Germany, it's very different. In Germany, the people are trained somehow that if the government says, then it must be true, whatever it says. And then to start to think, just starting to think that it could be that the government lies, this seems to be a very difficult thing. So when I was in school, we have been trained that we have to discuss whether A is true or B is true, and then we were discussing what could be, and then maybe I have to pretend to have a position in this discussion, which I do not have, but I just try to think as it would be my position. And this has changed completely. People want to have that opinion which feels great, where they feel comfortable, and it feels very comfortable to believe what the government says. And now to see by scientific proof that the government was lying, this is very, very difficult. And then in addition, after some 1 or 2 years of the pandemic, including the vaccination, then it starts to be very complicated to recognize that I was wrong in the last years, and maybe even that people have died because I have advertised something which I should not have advertised. For example, I really understand medical doctors. They have tried to do the best thing, and now they see, oops, there was something going wrong. That's a very hard task to see in the morning in the mirror and say, yes, it was wrong. And maybe it was even deadly, what I was pretending to be a good thing.
As the first anecdotal reports of the deadly side effects of the injections were being heard in alternative media, we then heard endlessly from mainstream media the phrase, correlation is not causation. What do you say about this expression?
This is true. Correlation is not causation. Nevertheless, first we have to face the fact that each time we are using statistics in medicine, we are just computing correlation. So if a new medicine occurs on the market, then we use statistical tools to prove that it's harmless and it's helpful. This is correlation, and if correlation is not causation, then all the statistical tools we are using, which are very helpful, then they should be omitted or ignored. So each time we invent something new, we use statistical tools, and then we behave the rest of our lives that if these correlations are used by a causal effect of the medicine. And so, yes, this is not a causal, so there's a difference between correlation and causation, but yes, on the other hand, what we see with respect to the vaccination is something which is very close to a proof of causation, because we start with vaccination and suddenly the excess mortality explodes, and it explodes precisely in these regions and these areas where the vaccination campaign was extremely successful, in the sense that a large number of people have been vaccinated. The more people have been vaccinated, the more increase of excess mortality we observe. So this more or less proves there's something going wrong with the vaccination. What clearly mathematicians cannot do, we cannot say what is going wrong precisely. Yeah, in this sense, we cannot say it's precisely this part of the vaccination which affects something. In this sense, we cannot say what the real effect of something is, but we can say there is some effect, and it's quite visible. And the correlation is 93%, so that's a proof that there's something going wrong with the vaccination. Ignoring that would be extremely silly and extremely dangerous.
I think you may have used the example of the correlation between smoking and the incidence of cancer in smokers, which I believe is a 75% correlation. Is that correct?
And no one would doubt that cancer is somehow an effect of smoking. Yeah, in this sense, there it is accepted, and if it's with the vaccination, then people say, no, that's only correlation.
You've pointed out that it is not possible to draw conclusions about the correlation of excess mortality with vaccination by only comparing vaccinated and non-vaccinated groups of the population. This might be non-intuitive to most people. Why is that? And what do you do to establish the true correlation?
So there are two different groups. There are vaccinated people and not vaccinated people, and they have a very different, for example, age structure. So if I just look at those two groups, then in one of the groups there are much more older people than the other group, which means that the mortality probability is very different for the different groups. From the very beginning, without any vaccination, it's just two different groups. And also the health conditions of the two groups is very different. So we have two different groups with a very different mortality probability. And now if the vaccination, or if one of the groups is vaccinated, then their mortality probability is changing, but it's still very different from the other group. So if we want to compare what's really going on, we have to have a look at the difference of the change of the mortality probability by this vaccination. Coming back to the smoking example we had just a minute ago, you would also do this in the smoking example. You have people who do not smoke, and then smoking changes your mortality probability and leads maybe to cancer. And so you are checking for the smoking, in the smoking example, what is the change of the mortality probability if you start smoking? Because it's dangerous, your mortality probability is increasing, independently of the original probability. If you are 80 years old and starting smoking, you start with a very different mortality probability than if you are 18 years old and you start smoking. Nevertheless, in both cases, the mortality probability is increasing because smoking might have negative effects on your health. And the same is for the vaccination. We are looking for the change of the mortality probability for the vaccinated group. And what would be expected is, if this is a good vaccination, which is more or less harmless in the sense there are no negative side effects, then your mortality probability during the pandemic should decrease, because it should be a good thing to get vaccinated. This is what we would expect, and therefore we are looking for the change of the mortality probability and not for the mortality probability of the whole group, which is very different from the very beginning due to the age structure and the health condition of the people in these groups.
So please explain what you compare to establish the correlation. Does it depend on knowing the vaccination status of individuals in the population?
No, so we don't have a good databases there, so that we would be able to say distinguish in Germany between the group of Germans who are not vaccinated and the Germans who are vaccinated. And what in particular we do not have, we would have to compute their mortality probabilities before the pandemic, and this is impossible. So there's a serious problem. If you have a medical study, when you invent a new medicine, then you start with two identical groups, and then you vaccinate one group with the real vaccination and the other gets something else which is harmless, and then you check the change of the mortality probability. You can't do that because you have very different groups and you don't know the mortality probabilities before the vaccination. So what we did is we had a look at the federal states. The federal states in Germany, there are 16 federal states, they have very different vaccination status. And they have very different mortality probabilities as a whole group. And so for each federal state, we had a look at how many people got vaccinated and what was the change of the mortality probability after the vaccination campaign. And this led to the possibility to have a look at 16 groups of people with a very different vaccination status. And so we had 16 different changes in mortality probabilities. And this was a possibility to use statistical tools.
Is there something unique about Germany with data being collected separately in the different federal states, which means what you did might be difficult in other countries?
Yes, this is true, but in principle, one could also do this on country level. So compare all states or countries in the European Union. They all have different vaccination status and different vaccination rates and different mortality probabilities. So there is a possibility to check this on a large scale, not only for Germany.
Do you see any interest from anyone to do this European country comparison that you've suggested?
There was one paper with some people from Italy doing that. They compared 27 states or countries in Europe with different vaccination status, but they did it in the wrong way. They measured the mean mortality probability from the year 2020 to 23. And this is a period where in the first year there was no vaccination at all. The second year was the vaccination campaign. And the third year, everyone who wanted was vaccinated. And if you take the whole group, then you mix up all vaccinated and not vaccinated people. So the result was a disaster. It was total nonsense. And we wrote to the authors and also to the journal that this is a nonsense paper. And the results shouldn't be taken serious. And then we took their data. They have serious data about the vaccination status and the mortality probabilities. And we could prove that with their data, there's a positive correlation between the increase in excess mortality and the vaccination rate, also in whole of Europe. So we can see, using the data of European states, that vaccination is not a good idea. It is increasing the mortality probability, not only in Germany, but also in the whole European Union. But the people in the paper did it in the wrong way. It was nonsense.
If I may ask, did you yourself take these injections? And also, what would you say to the many people who did take these toxic substances, yet suffered no side effects and probably think that the products were absolutely fine?
In my case, I was on the list for the vaccination, because in Germany you had to be put on a list and then you waited for some weeks and then they told you, yes, now it's possible. And I was on this list, and then politicians started to say strange things in Germany. They were speaking about Volksverräter and Volksschädlinge und die Volksgesundheit. And this reminded me on dark times in Germany, and then decided I don't want to be part of that. Never again. And so I'm not vaccinated, no. But this is just because politicians said things where I thought you should not say something like that in Germany. Never ever. But I know that many people are vaccinated, and coming to the second part of the question, many people don't have any side effects because of the vaccination. So many people had short-term side effects, something like 2 weeks of having fever or lying in a bed, but many of the people don't have long-term side effects, negative side effects. That's true, but that's true for many things. So if you're smoking, then this doesn't mean automatically that after 2 years you are dead. There are many people, including Churchill, who I think he was very old and was smoking all the time, or in Germany, Helmut Schmidt is one of the examples. So there's no automatism that if you do something bad, then you're immediately dead after 5 weeks or something like this. We just see on a large scale by statistical tools that an enormous number of people died connected to the vaccination. In Germany, there's something like an excess mortality during the pandemic of 100,000 people. That's more or less the excess mortality. And none of them is in the first year of the pandemic. So the first year of the pandemic without vaccination, this was a very usual, normal year. But when the vaccination started, then we observed 100,000 additional unexpected people dying. But this is not 80 million. It's just a certain part, but it's a proportion of people dying unexpectedly we have not seen since the Second World War. So, but not everyone who was vaccinated observes a negative side effect. That's true.
Is there anything more that you would like the public to know about your research? And where can people go to find the reports of what you have done?
If you're interested in the papers and in our investigations, then on my homepage at my university, you'll find all the papers. And for Germany, at least, I would say you should not only listen to the official television, but try to read newspapers and the whole range from the left to the right. Have a look at blogs. Just be informed and not just listening to the politicians. This would be my advice. And stay critical. Not everything in the internet is true. So from both sides, there are strange things which are said. So stay critical, don't believe everything, and try to be informed as good as is possible.